Not yet.
No.
There we go.
There she goes.
Okay.
Yeah, she's always there.
Yeah.
The only thing is that it's not so predictable. Okay. Oh, we are live so fast today. Oh, here we are. Let's see if we get. The only thing is that I'll say hello in the chat to make sure someone is there. Hello. Hi. And we can start talking. This is going to be recorded anyway, so we can talk about stuff that is not that nobody wants to miss at the beginning, that they can go back to. This is
okay.
Interesting.
I'll follow your lead.
Okay. Tell us about the weather in Virginia.
Today the weather
is we already have
a little bit gray and rainy. I was out earlier this morning, sort of drizzling. Probably it's our first day of summer here today, and temperature is upper 70s Fahrenheit. So I'm not sure what that is Celsius.
Either. I think it's how many? How what did you say?
It's
30
upper
degrees.
70s Fahrenheit.
70s. Oh, it's like a mild summer. Like mild. Doesn't sound like very hot.
It's not very hot for here. No, it'll get hotter. It'll probably get about 20 degrees hotter. We're just heading into summer right now. So, but everything is very green. We've had a lot of rain, so we have lots of beautiful green. I just pulled out a weed from my garden. It was literally this long. Seriously. Wow. It was crazy. I know. So we've had a lot of rain so far.
Well, we're starting the winter anytime soon. Today, tomorrow.
Wait, it broke up a little.
When winter really starts, because it's not exactly the 21st. Okay. But the weather is great here. I'm in. I don't know where. Some people joined the chat. I know they are not from my town, so if they want to say where they are, they are scattered around Argentina.
Oh, cool.
I'm having a sunny day today.
Oh, nice.
Sunny day. Okay. Let's get started by talking a little bit about TPAC. Most of the people here with us probably know what TPAC is, but it's good to have a kind of quick review and how important that is in general, and especially now that we are teaching online a lot with technology.
Okay. Yes, absolutely. So TPAC is an abbreviation for technology, pedagogy, and content knowledge. And it is assumed to be the knowledge that teachers at any level of any content area need in order to be able to teach successfully with digital tools and resources. And it's built on a much older conception of teachers' knowledge, PCK, or pedagogical content knowledge, which Lee Schulman first named and started doing research about in the mid to late 1980s. And it's very, very important because not just in terms of successful teaching, but also because Lee Schulman was the first person to draw attention to the fact that teachers have very highly specialized knowledge, that teachers are truly experts. Before Lee Schulman drew attention to this in the late 1980s, the reputation of teachers was very poor. There was an assumption in many places that as long as you knew the content, you could teach it. And we all know that that's not true. That you, of course, need to know the content, but there's a very special accompanying part of teachers' expertise that is knowledge about how to teach and how to teach content in different content areas and different sets of learners' needs can be quite different. So when you add to that very complex, very specialized knowledge, then knowledge about how to teach well with digital technologies, it becomes even more complex. So I think that's one of the reasons why TPAC has really taken off all around the world in terms of not only researchers, educational researchers, but also practitioners, because people realize from their own experience that teaching the technology well is not easy.
It's not easy.
So this explains why, and we see that especially now in times of COVID, because most of us have had to make a very quick switch to teaching remotely, from perhaps teaching face-to-face, and then a week later teaching remotely. And so I think everybody got a lesson. We didn't realize how complex it was when we experienced that ourselves. I have to say I'm lucky because I've been teaching online for more than 30 years. So for me, it wasn't much of a switch, but it's complex. For me, it became a real challenge to do meetings online, faculty meetings online. Who knew that was going to be really, really complex? And so I can imagine for folks not used to teaching online, it's a big challenge.
Definitely. How can we teach our students to understand the complexity of teaching with technology?
Well, that's a big question, Carla. I think one of the best ways to understand the complexity is, well, there are two ways that I can think of that would work really well. One is to really analyze, really view and analyze your own teaching. One of the reasons why I think in many teacher preparation programs, including ours here at my university, we have folks videotaping their teaching. Not just once, but many times, often called micro teaching. And so then you play back the videotape along with a more experienced teacher or several teachers. It works well in groups to analyze what made you choose that particular question that you asked the students, or how can we tell how well the students understand or don't understand by their responses to questions. How can we tell whether students are truly on task or not? Because of course their behavior can be very different for different students with different learning preferences and styles. So that's one way to
I have a question about that.
Sure.
When you refer to micro teaching, do you refer to a real lesson that you videotape for a little while, or like kind of a mock lesson in another context?
That's a good question. We do it both ways, and of course, I think it's better to practice. It's more comfortable for the students to practice in front of each other. So in our programs, we often have students, are people learning to be teachers. We call them pre-service teachers. So they will design a lesson or project, and then they teach it, sort of mock teach it with the other students in their class who are learning to be teachers, and then they get feedback from the students and from the professor. But then we also do it when they're in their classroom placement. So in our program, students who are learning to be teachers are in real classrooms at least one day a week from the very beginning of their program, and then they increase the number of days as they go through the program until the point towards the end when they are student teaching. And so there for 10 weeks, they are the teacher in that particular classroom, and they stay with the same classroom so that they learn, what the school year is like, and they learn the students' characteristics, more in depth. So you can do it both ways. Experienced teachers find it really helpful to do, sometimes it's called lesson study, originally from Japan, where you videotape yourself and you share the materials with another group of teachers, videotape down the materials, and then you literally sit together and observe and provide feedback. It's incredibly helpful. It's helpful at the university level, honestly, for us to do it with our teachers.
Right. Yes. Okay. You said two things. One was micro teaching.
Oh, micro teaching, and the original question was what makes teaching with technology complex? No. Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay.
No. How to help our students understand the complexity of teaching with ICT?
Got it. Okay. All right. And so so one way is sort of examining your own teaching. The other way is to look at lots of examples. There are lots of, for example, case studies online. I helped with a book of case studies of exemplary learning in classrooms in which digital tools and resources have been integrated really well in different content areas. And so So looking at those and communicating with other teachers, frankly, I mean, there are, for example, every week there's a Twitter chat called SunChat, SUNCHAT, where experienced teachers from literally all over the world, get together online and they ask each other questions, they share resources. It's like it's a virtual community. Many of the teachers are participating every week or close to every week. Watching other teachers virtually, if you can't do it during the day, which is typically difficult for folks who are working full time, watching other teachers virtually, especially if the teachers comment on like why they chose to use these technologies in these particular ways, can be really helpful. As a matter of fact, in a lot of research about teachers, asking them about their own professional learning or professional development, there are multiple studies that show that teachers, their number one preference in terms of their own learning is to watch other teachers teach and then talk to them about what they just saw. And so it's hard to schedule, but those are really important activities, especially for something that you're unfamiliar with, if you're unfamiliar with teaching with a particular digital tool, for example.
Great. Once I've been reading texts and watching your videos and conferences, and somewhere you said that the inclusion of technology in pedagogy further complicates teaching. What does that mean in general, and what does that mean nowadays, again, in this?
Yeah. Well, like every time, we know this as teachers, right? So every time something changes in the classroom, everything changes, right? And so in many cases, you have a particular class, and let's say that there's one or two students who are more rambunctious, so they might talk a little bit more, they might get off task a little bit more than the others. I tend to love those students in particular because I learn a lot from them, right? But when we're trying to keep the class on task, that can be a real challenge. That student's absent, we all know this, the entire class changes, right? If one student who typically interacts in a particular way is absent for a day, the whole class changes. So you can imagine then that something that simple can make things change, right? You get a new student, everything changes, right? But you can imagine then what happens when we have these tools that, especially if the students are using them, there's all of these possibilities for things not to work the way that you expected them to, right? Or the way that you practiced. So there are the technical issues. There are also, frankly, a lot of times we focus on the technical issues. Honestly, my experience, it's much more complex to plan so that what students are actually doing with the digital tools and resources makes sense in terms of their learning. So a long time ago, my colleagues and I made up what we called the Is It Worth It test. So anytime that you're considering using a particular digital tool for a particular lesson or project or whatever, ask yourself, after you've planned out how it is that you think you want to use that tool, ask yourself honestly, will this help the students to do something that they need to do for their learning that they either can't do without the tool, or they can do better with the tool? So if you can't justify, that's the is it worth it question, right? If you can't justify to yourself that the students using the tool, that their learning will be better, or they'll be able to learn something or do something that's important that they couldn't do without the tool, there's no reason to use the tool. If it works better for their learning for them to use traditional tools, paper, pencil, books, whatever, then you should use that. You should only use the digital tools when they're going to really improve the students' learning, right? So
this is beautiful question. This is so important, and sometimes we get engaged because there's a new technology coming out and we want to use it and we don't really understand the purpose of it. This is so good.
Yes, and honestly, some school administrators, because they work so hard to get the tools to our classrooms, so interactive whiteboards is a particularly good example, right? So some principals are so proud they have interactive whiteboards in so many of the classrooms or learning spaces in the school, and then they really want the teachers to use them, but it can be really challenging, especially when you have a large class, to use it in a way that's not just for showing PowerPoints. You know, like, why would you use an interactive whiteboard just to show a PowerPoint? It doesn't make sense, right? Because the actual characteristics, they're called affordances of the technology, right? What's the primary affordance of an interactive whiteboard? The touch, right? And so if the students are not there actually able to interact with it, if that's not part of the learning, why would we use it? Which is why, sadly, in many classrooms that are outfitted with interactive whiteboards without asking the teachers, they end up being just for presentations, or I've definitely seen classrooms where their paper stuck to them, you know, because they're another, my screensaver just, did I just disappear for a second?
No, it's okay.
Oh, good. My screensaver went on. So, so that's in educational technology research, we tend to think of particular tools as having affordances and constraints, right? And so we all, as teachers, we have to think about those, right? So what are the particular affordances? For example, word processors have lots of affordances, right? For students writing with the word processor. Not writing by hand and then typing it up with the word processor, right? But actually writing with the word processor. All kinds of affordances and being able to easily move around text and spell check and grammar check and all of that, right? And so, so think about it in terms of what are the affordances? What can the students actually do better with this particular tool than traditional tools? And then constraints, you know, like, how much time is it going to take, for example, for the students to learn to use this tool? And is that time worthwhile in the bigger picture, in terms of the limited amount of time that we have with them in the classroom versus the benefit that they'll get from using it? So you're right, just because it's new and it's cool and you could do neat things with it, you really have to use critical thinking here as teachers to think about, for this particular group of students at this particular time, given what we want them to learn in this lesson or project or unit, does it make sense? Is it the best use of time and effort at this point in time? That might change in the future, but at this point in time, does it make sense? Is it worth it? In other words.
Well, this is great. Speaking of technology, you said somewhere that technologies are opaque. This is particularly dangerous in general, and I guess that now that we are using so much technology, so much for everything, we need to be careful about that, right?
Yeah. One of the things, they're opaque in a number of ways, actually. One of the things that people don't realize is that technologies actually carry culture with them. They are not neutral at all. And we've known this for more than 20 years, but a lot of people think that because the technologies are machines, that somehow they don't carry with them particular influences on people's behaviors and attitudes, etc. And so it's not that we should then refuse to use them, but we really have to be careful in thinking about, as we're using them, could we be very careful to use them in ways that don't reinforce stereotypes, for example, you know, that don't that serve our children's learning needs, as opposed to reinforce, for example, socioeconomic stratification or keep away students with different kinds of learning preferences and learning methods. So, for example, if there's a group of students working together, let's say a small group of students working together, and let's say that they are keeping track of their work with, let's say, real simple, with the word processor, right? So they're keeping notes on that. So I think as a teacher, you really need to think about, like, so who is it that's actually going to keep the notes for the group, right? So do you want it to be the same student who is the fastest typist? You know, or is that disadvantaging other students in terms of building their typing skills, and even is that disadvantaging them interpersonally? in that particular group, right? Because we all know that there's all kinds of unconscious stratification that happens, among our students for all kinds of reasons, cultural, linguistic, all kinds of gender-related reasons, right? And so as teachers, we need to really think about these things in the same ways that we would think about them with traditional tools. But unfortunately, because technologies have so much power in them, we tend to assume that their benefits are all positive. They can be positive, but we have to think in the same critical way that we would with any other kinds of non-digital tools. What are we reinforcing in the ways that we're actually asking the students to use them? I hope that's not too general, but
no, it's I think it's something that sometimes we don't have the time to stop and think about, because we just assume that it's just a naive thing that we put in the class and we do what we did before. This is terrible. And I guess that everything we're talking about takes us to the importance of setting clear goals before starting, right?
Yeah.
What can you tell us about goals and aims?
Yeah, I mean, as teachers, if you think about it, it's sort of like, why would we have to say this again, right? We know this. We know this, that's the first thing you have to do when you plan anything. You plan, even a very short lesson, like a 10-minute lesson for a group of young children. We have to think about what is it that we want them to learn. So both content and process, right? And so sometimes it's, only process if it's sort of a skills-based kind of lesson. But
we have for teachers of English, we have a little disadvantage that sometimes we have textbooks that are so well organized that teaching is just about deciding how many activities fit in a 40-minute period or 80-minute period. And sometimes we forget to put the goals first and then choose because books are also technologies. Whatever you choose comes at the end of you have these 5 steps, like first the goals, and then let's see what book, what activity, what page, what technology.
Yeah,
One
of the frustrations that I remember having, I started as an elementary school teacher. One of the frustrations that I remember having at first was when I didn't have choices about the materials that I use, right? When I'm required to use a particular textbook, until one of my professors reminded me, this is when I was student teaching, one of my professors reminded me that even if we are restricted to a textbook, we can usually supplement it with other materials, right? So materials from the library, or now materials online. Or B, we don't necessarily have to, and we probably can't, do everything in the order that's suggested in the teacher's guide. The whole idea of a teacher's guide is not to give us a step-by-step, everybody has to do this in the same way. That's the whole point of learning to be a teacher and really learning about your students and watching, their progress as you work with them, so that we can select, change the sequence. And of course, now, because we have so many more tools available, we can change the kinds of tools that we use, that we ask the students to use in terms of their learning. So yeah, so it seems obvious, but it's astounding actually how often we forget that even in a very short lesson, of course, like a project or a unit, we tend to think about like, what are the learning goals? But even on a very small scale, it's like just to focus for ourselves. Okay, what is it that's most important? There's usually going to be more than one goal, right? But what's most important for the students to understand and or be able to do? And that has to be what we choose first. Then once we think of that, then before we even jump to the activities, our research shows that we really have to think about all of the contextual complexities, right? So something as simple as, if we're going to be using a digital tool, like, do we have just one for the entire class, like an interactive whiteboard? If so, how do I structure things, right? So that the students I might have 25 students, but I only have 5 iPads, right? So how am I going to structure that? Do I want all of them using in small groups the iPad at the same time? Or do we rotate, right? So that we have a group of 5 students using the 5 iPads, while other groups of students are using different tools and resources, right? And then how do we make sure that everybody rotates through all of those learning stages? Simple things like that, all the way up to incredibly complex things that are so important, Like, what about children who arrive at school without breakfast? So how do we handle that? What about children whose clothes are dirty and the other students might be making fun of them? Like, how do we do? Because we know Abraham Maslow told us that without those safety and security issues taken care of, children are not going to learn well. And if you think about it, like at one point we made a big list, a colleague and I made a big list of all of the different kinds of contextual factors that teachers are constantly thinking about. Has nothing directly to do with technology at all, right? And we tend to think about them just because that's part of our job. But when we introduce technology into this, it makes it more complex, like we said a couple of minutes ago. And then that means then that this is yet another set of contextual factors, right? So what we suggest in folks who in your class who read the article that of ours that you gave them, that you first think about the learning goals. Yeah, that is most important. Then think about all the relevant contextual factors. So how much room you have to move around in the classroom, whether the students are allowed to go unaccompanied to other places in the school. How much time do you have? Time is a huge contextual factor, right? Once you figure out all of those, right, that's going to influence, how much of those learning goals are going to be accomplished. That's when then you choose the learning activities, and that's our work is in supplying comprehensive taxonomies of all of the different kinds of learning activities, 9 different curriculum areas, and we have a taxonomy also for learning English. English is a second.
Before we go to the taxonomies, in the second moment of the decisions we make according to the context, Analia says that we assume that this is in the chat.
Yep.
We assume that children are digital natives, but when it comes to schoolwork, this seems to be actually untrue. So what do you think about that? Like, we assume they are.
I'm so glad this came up. This is a really good point. That assumption, that has been with us. I started using computers with my elementary school students in 1980. That's how long I've been around, right? And the teachers, I started teaching teachers also in 1983. And even at that time, people were saying the same thing, that we make this assumption about children, even just younger people, it doesn't have to be children. We make this assumption about people in their 20s. That somehow, because they're younger, that they somehow know how to teach with technologies. Let me tell you, there's lots of research, and plus just our own experience, that says this is not necessarily true. Think about it. The kinds of skills that we use to go on Facebook, to do any sort of social media kinds of interactions, are not at all the same kinds of skills that we use, that students use to learn with these technologies, and that teachers to teach with the technologies. So even though there is, over time, because the interfaces have gotten much more intuitive for the tools themselves, there's typically less of a learning curve than what we saw 20 or more years ago for both teachers and students. And yeah, maybe because if kids have access, if they have access to digital tools, not all kids do, of course, then maybe they're more comfortable experimenting with things and learning to use the tool. That's totally different. It's a prerequisite, totally different than actually using it to learn. That's a whole new set of skills and understandings that not only the students need, but we as their teachers need to develop. That's one of the reasons for TPACK, as a matter of fact, one of the reasons for the learning activity types taxonomies that we made to try to help that. It's way more complex to help someone to understand how to teach well with technologies, which are complex, like we said before, which are opaque, like we said before, than just to learn how to use the tools. To learn how to use the tools is what everybody focuses on, and then they think it's intuitive after that about how to teach with them. Why should it be? Because we're teaching in completely different ways in some cases when we use the tools. So I agree. I mean, to show you how old I am, some of the teachers, when I worked at the University of Nebraska as a professor, was the first place I was a full-time professor. Some of the teachers, they were experienced teachers in my class, said that the assumption is that kids are born with Atari wrist. Atari looked like a game, and like as a joke, like, oh, so the kids are born, like knowing how to do this. It's like, of course they're not. And
I don't know.
certainly not in terms of learning and teaching. And so that's something that we have to help them to learn. Just like with young children, we have to help them to learn how to hold a pencil correctly and how to write, with that pencil. It's essentially the same.
Okay, so we've talked about the goals, the decisions. Now let's talk about the activities. The third step.
So the learning activity types, one of the things, my colleague Mark Hofer and we ended up working with other curriculum specialists also, and I can put the URL in the chat if you'd like for where you can get these. These are free materials that are available, and we have Spanish translations for them also. One of the things that we realized is that, and it's still true today, unfortunately, that a lot of times when we teach teachers how to teach with digital tools, we focus on the tools. So Seymour Papert published this in 1980, that we are technocentric, that we tend to focus on the technologies and the affordances and constraints of the technologies, right? And so thinking that if we learn how to use the tool and if we learn about the things that it can do, then automatically we'll know how to teach with it well. And like I've already said, that's absolutely not true, and we have lots of research to show that. So my colleague Mark and I thought, well, in order to help teachers, because who has enough time, first of all, to learn all these tools and then sit and figure out with other teachers, what are the ways that we could use this? What we decided was that, what we saw from our research was that we needed to provide materials for teachers who are unfamiliar with how to teach with particular tools, that we needed materials for teachers to help them to plan. And we wanted to make sure that these were the opposite of being technocentric, the opposite of focusing on tools for all the reasons that we already discussed. So we then worked with curriculum specialists in each of 9 curriculum areas to make comprehensive taxonomies of all of the different kinds of learning activities that you can do within that particular content area. And then the idea is that once you've selected the learning goals and considered the contextual kinds of pedagogical decisions, that you then go through the taxonomy in the appropriate curriculum area or areas, since obviously sometimes we teach multiple, especially at the elementary level, curriculum areas together, and select all of the potential learning activity types that could help the students, in your opinion, to accomplish those goals. And you go through, and this is all explained on the website. Then you go through those that initial list of activities, and you narrow it down to the activities that you want to combine into a lesson, project, or unit to help students accomplish those particular goals. Then you sequence them. Then, as the last step, after you have the lesson, project, or unit planned, you then go and select the technology. So we have, for every learning activity type, we have a column of suggested technologies. It's not all of the technologies that you can use, but the ones that we think would probably work best. And so these are sort of tools, they're aids for teachers in their planning, both people learning to be teachers and also experienced teachers. And I should say we also have a taxonomy for teaching strategies for teachers of English as a second language or English as a foreign language, so that, and that particular taxonomy, our 10th taxonomy, is meant to be used in combination with the content area taxonomy. So you do what I just described for the content area, and then layer on top of that the particular ESOL strategies that would work well, in your opinion, with that sequence of learning activity types that you've already selected for that lesson, project, or unit. And I should also say that the learning activity types also include assessments, all kinds of assessments.
Let's talk about assessment too, and rubrics, please.
Yeah. So Mark and I and our other colleagues, we went back and forth about this, because we know that in some ways of thinking about teaching, that people think of assessment sort of as a separate step. And of course, they're lots of ways of teaching where you start with the assessments, right? So it's often called backward design. So you start with the assessments and then you figure out what those are going to be in terms of the learning goals, and then you fill in the activities after that. Really doesn't matter whether you start with the assessments or end with the assessments. We really came to the conclusion that assessments are learning activities. And if they're not, they're probably not worthwhile. It's one of the reasons why, at least here in the US, we have problems with standardized tests, because you're not really learning often. And so, or any, I guess. And so, so we included all of the different kinds of both formative assessments, ones that are done while students are learning in a particular unit, let's say, and summative assessments as learning activity types. And there are many more formative types of assessment that a lot of people don't realize can be both learning activities and formative assessment activities, which is when folks who are new to teaching, when they realize that, there's often such relief that they feel, because typically we think about assessments as having to be like tests or quizzes at the end of a unit. And okay, you can use those, but you can get in many ways a lot better information about what students have learned and what they need to learn still from formative assessments, from ways of looking at their written material, for example, ways of understanding their answers to questions during discussions. You can, in many ways, that I found is a lot more helpful to help you know what they understand, what they don't understand, what they need to learn to do still, what they can already do, from sort of combining the assessment with the actual learning activity. So I don't mean to be discouraging of summative assessments. I'm just saying I don't think we need to just rely on that as much.
That's not enough. Do you know, do you remember, have you heard of a specific activity for teaching English to students of other languages that you consider valuable, interesting, or where TPAC was and the 5 steps, were visible and well done, and like the best experience you remember teaching English?
Unfortunately, I'm not a teacher of English, so
I know. I know.
So yeah, and so I would have to take a look at the ESOL taxonomy. But my colleague Marcella Van Olfen, who's at St. Leo University in Florida, Marcella, from what I remember when we worked with her, she actually helped us with both the foreign language learning activity types taxonomy and the ESOL learning activity types taxonomy. So she was our curriculum expert for those. I'm remembering a lot of examples that she shared with us, so these are not my examples, which use literature and literature that is of interest to the students. So I'm assuming more modern kinds of literature, and ones that, at least that appealed to me, where students, for example, would write a script, like they're learning about a particular, whatever it is that they're learning, let's say in social studies, and they would write a script and edit the script and then perform the skit, perhaps videotape it, and then give each other feedback. I guess that would be more of like a project, you know. Mm-hmm. And so my understanding, and again, this is not my specialty, so I'm going to sound very naive here, but my understanding is that what Marcella was trying to get them to do was to do less of the let's just do these exercises, right? Mm-hmm. So that we can practice spoken and written English, and put it more in a context that would be meaningful to the students, right? Mm-hmm. So you know, an earlier version of that for younger students would be, you know, learning to write simple stories about their experiences, right? So if they're learning English, then they would write it in English. If they're learning another language, they would write it in another language, and then share those stories, publish those stories like with each other. But it actually, I remember Marcella giving us examples of, you know, like students reading and performing some of the simpler Shakespeare plays, for example, you know, like when they're on much more sophisticated levels, as part of both social studies and learning English. So, you know, things like that. I remember she talked also about raps, that that students would create, or ones that they would listen to, the ones without the curse words in them, that the students would listen to because it's, they're so motivating for them, and then they would then, after listening and studying, better understanding the language, then also creating them. So I don't know if that's the kind of thing that you're asking for, but.
Yes, yes. We have a very nice comment again, and Elias says that some teachers believe that virtual lessons should mirror how they teach at school. And like you just put your old way of teaching into the computer. No.
Yeah, and I can tell by how the question is being asked that the person contributing the question doesn't agree. I don't agree either. No, I think that, in the same way, it's not really different if you think about it, just because we're trying to teach via Zoom or whatever, or this particular platform. We think about, just like we think about in the classroom, like I mentioned before, if we have a smaller classroom, and so there isn't as much room to move around, right? And so what do we do within that context, understanding what it is that our students need to learn and understanding them as people, right? So, so it's very difficult, especially for younger children, for example, to sit in a desk, for a long period of time. So in the same way that we figure out ways to get them out of their desks, in a way that doesn't, turn into chaos, it's the same thing with digital tools and technology. So for example, when we had to shift in mid-March at my university to teaching completely online, we openly chose between synchronous teaching, like here, for example, like what we're doing here, versus asynchronous. So literally, we think about what, if anything, could the students do independently with materials that we either made for them and or provided for them from that we pulled from elsewhere, to let them do this so that they're not having to sit in front of an interactive video conferencing screen like this for very long periods of time. For the kinds of classes that needed to be synchronous. So, for example, last semester I was teaching a graduate course on academic writing and presentation. And in the middle of the semester, we've gotten to a place where everybody had a manuscript that they were working on. And I had taught them how to give each other structured feedback, writer's workshop feedback on that. Well, in that case, writer's workshop is most effective when you do it in real time, right? We do this not only with adults, we do this also with everywhere from upper elementary to high school students. Well, in that particular case, it made sense for us to use Zoom, for us to do Zoom, because it was that real-time interaction between the authors and the rest of the class that had read the manuscripts and were providing constructive feedback. That makes sense. But does it make sense? I don't believe. Did it make sense for me to lecture in real time? Absolutely not. I rarely lecture anyway. You can't tell from what I'm doing now, but I rarely lecture anyway. But if you think that it's important to give a short lecture, why not videotape it so that the students can watch it, they can pause it, they can rewind it? I would think, especially if you're speaking in a language that's not their first language, it's important for them to have that option. So it's nothing different really from the same kinds of contextual decisions, context-based decisions that we make in the physical classroom. The context, though, becomes the digital affordances and constraints. So in a platform like the one that we're using now, I don't know, are there like small groups? You can put people into small groups, that kind of thing. You can do that.
I'm not sure about that.
In Zoom, you can do that, right? And so, like giving them as much variety as, even as adults, giving them as much variety and different kinds of learning activities as possible, making sure that we have more sort of visual kinds of things, so people sharing their screens, which I know you can do here, I just saw it, sharing their screens, multiple people sharing screens and commenting on that. There's a whiteboard kind of thing, So it's helpful to know what the tools can do, but only in as much as that helps you to think about, okay, from the student's perspective, given what it is that I want them to be able to know and do as a result of their participating in this lesson, project, or unit, then what's going to be the most engaging, most well-matched set of activities within a particular structures? How is that going to be most effective? We do that in the physical classroom every day. We're just not used to doing it, many of us, in a platform like this.
Okay, Judi, this has been so nice, so good talking to you. I feel like I'm happy to share ideas and to hear from experts like you say some of the things we tell our students, and like we have more evidence now that this is something we should consider at least. So thank you for that. Thank you a lot for your time.
Sure. Do you want me to put if folks are interested in the learning activity types, taxonomies, you want me to I can put that in the chat box here?
No, they don't see the chat box, but I can put it in there when the video is recorded. I can put it as a comment. You can send it to me, and I can copy and paste your text as part of the video description. That'd be great.
Okay. Yeah, I would. Okay. Yeah. I mean, they're there for all teachers to use. So, so please do. And thanks so much for inviting me. This is fun.
Okay. And I would like to thank Magdalena Mondria. She's translating live from English into Spanish. That's a skill I don't have, and I admire so much. She's been texting like summarizes of what we say. Wow. Wow.
Wow, it's amazing. Wow. Wow, it's true.
It's awesome. Okay. Okay. So I'll stop streaming. Thank you very much for everybody here. I hope that you enjoyed it. They said yes.